But we got a really good one that I want to talk about first. And this is a discussion from a post that has gone up from independent developer Paul Taylor. He runs the company Mode 7. They are the ones behind titles like Frozen Synapse. They are publishing the game The Colonists. Sorry about that. And he has been doing things now for quite a bit. Let's see. According to his post, he's been doing 17 years of involvement with indie games. But he made a piece on Gamasutra and Medium and all that about top 10 secrets to indie game success and why they do not exist. And it's kind of his thoughts on what it means to be an independent game developer and actually succeed when it comes to this industry. I want to see if I can pull him up here, and I'll post a link to it in the comments. 1 second. Here it is. But here it is in chat if anyone wants to read it. Hopefully the link will actually go through. But he talked about how much the independent scene has changed. And obviously that's been a major topic that we have discussed time and time and again here on the live stream as well as on our various videos and casts. But the idea behind the independent game movement has certainly changed from the last decade to even from the end and where we're at now. As we've said, when it comes to independent game development, it originally was kind of this just weird idea to make games on your own, or make games without the aid of a major studio backing you. And outside of examples like Introversion, Crow Team, and Spireweb Software, most independent games were considered usually like bottom of the barrel, your shovelware that you find in a Walmart or a Target bargain bin. I remember buying a few like those very weird collections of games where it's just literally just like one screen and that's about it. And things obviously started to change at the end of the last decade when we started to see more of an interest in the mainstream market, and especially from publishers from the independent scene. And as we've said, the big thing that kind of jump-started this was Xbox or Microsoft's Summer of Indie Games, when they began to promote developers like Jonathan Blow, Edmund McMillan, and of course everybody's favorite, Phil Fish. And what ended up happening was all of a sudden the independent scene took off, and people began to realize that, hey, there are quality games coming from these very small developers. Sometimes it could be 2 to 5 man teams, sometimes it's just a solo developer. And it suddenly became possible to get that recognition. And of course, helping things out further was Steam. And of course, Steam's open market to allow anyone to get on. Or at least it began, or slowly began that way, as it started to open up with stuff like Early Access, Greenlight, and Steam Direct now. But it's a far different market today than it was 10, 15 years ago. Back then, you release a game by yourself and oh my god, you are special, you are unique. Today, we see about 24 games being released daily, and I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot more of those games when we get to our Weird Games segment later on. But the idea that you can be special and stand out because you made a game without a publisher is no longer the case these days. And Paul's view from basically being around for that long, I would love to get him on for a cast to discuss this further, really shows how much things have changed and how much the perception of being an independent developer has as well. When we look at the idea behind indie, and of course, if Mike or XP is on right now, I'm sure he's going to leave a comment down below. But the idea of what is or isn't an independent developer has certainly shifted. And from the last decade, when we discuss the idea of being indie was simply the idea of your stepping stone from making a game on your own to being hired by a major studio or you becoming a big studio. Now today, the term indie can mean who knows what. from developers who just want to stay and make games by themselves to, again, those who are seeking that greater pool. It's kind of a very weird analog or very weird comparison to the indie filmmaking scene, where people who remember indie developer or indie filmmakers like Sam Raimi back in the 70s and 80s, the idea behind something like Friday the 13th, and again, many more. And again, the idea was you're not really supposed to stay in the indie scene. If you're good enough, they're going to notice you and you're going to get pushed up. Again, Sam Raimi went on to direct films like Spider-Man, and I can't remember some of his other big name ones, but he has, of course, become a major player in the film industry. To stay somewhat topical, the whole discussion about James Gunn is a big example of this. James originally got his start with Troma, basically the king of the B or C movie craze, depending on who you talk to. But the point is that for a lot of people, being indie is kind of seen as that stepping stone or that stepladder. But today, it's become a far different story. With the quality and quantity of games being released, if you're able to understand the market and make games, you can pretty much make a name and business for yourself. Developers like Cliff Harris, Jay Burgett, let me see, there's any other big names. Of course, Jeff Vogue, and I'm forgetting probably 2 to 3 dozen other examples as I'm sitting here. But it's no longer considered the idea that you make an independent game and then you get acquired by a big name studio. If you do things right and make a big success, you can make a livelihood out of your small studio. Probably the biggest example of this right now would be Red Hook Games with Darkest Dungeon. We've talked about them many times over and how they have become the poster child for how to succeed at the independent game side of things. But with that said, and what's the bad thing, is that with so many developers trying to get in, it becomes harder to really understand what it means to succeed as an indie developer. And some developers will succeed just by, pure luck and sheer will, but you can't rely on that. And with so many games being released, it's important to understand that there is no true secret to independent success. But there are things that you can do to kind of mitigate those risks. So we're going to try and go down the line here from Paul's article. And again, if you're interested, I'll put a link to it in the recorded description as well. But the first thing they talked about is familiarity and novelty. And this is a huge one, and this is one that I really love to talk about. Because as we've said before, one of the big differences between indie and major developers is the line between uniqueness versus refinement. And when we look at these games, AAA development definitely focuses on refinement, with Blizzard probably being the de facto king, absolute king of the hill of this design. The idea that you're not making something new, but you're making something so polished and refined that it almost becomes new in of itself. Blizzard is masters at solving a problem when it comes to a game. As in, if this is the MMO game or the MMO design, how do we remove all the frustrating points of it and just leave the best? How do we make a really good CCG? There's your Hearthstone. How do we make a team-based FPS? You have Overwatch, and then Heroes of the Storm, and so on and so forth. So they don't really go for making something completely outside the box, but they make such a great product that you can't help but want to try it out and see just what it is. While on the independent side of things, they go for uniqueness, and we have certainly played our fair share of unique games here on the channel, be it from what we just talked about with Fission Superstar X, that game we played, The Path of Modus, I forget the top of my head, Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, Cave Blazers, Bomber Crew. I'm just pretty much rattling off what we play on the Grab Bag stream, but you get the point. The whole major attraction for a lot of people to the independent scene is being able to make a game that you want to make that may not be that bestseller or that game that's going to topple Fortnite or Call of Duty. And that passion has led to some amazing titles. As a big case in point, as I'm recording this right now, we have the Kickstarter going for the game Boyfriend Dungeon by Kid Fox Games, which is going to be a roguelike dating sim where your weapons can turn to real people that you can actually date. And I can tell you pretty much that Activision or EA is probably not interested in publishing a game like that. But the point is, and what Paul talked about, is that there is so far that you can go on either extreme. If your game is too familiar, then you're just ripping off somebody else, as we've seen with the slew of Battle Royale clones. If your game is too unique, however, then you're going to make something that really isn't going to appeal to anyone outside of yourself or your close-knit friends. And we have talked about this many times over, that it's easy to make this crazy mishmash of a game that nobody really wants to play, because maybe the UI is horrible. Maybe you're not good at making an interesting level, or taking this design to the point that it is sellable. But the idea is you have to be able to understand both sides. Being able to make something that is going to stand out from everybody else, but at the same time is going to be your own unique stamp on the genre or on the game. Now, moving on, his next point is one that I think has definitely been a big issue for a lot of developers, and that is being able to release a game. Sorry, my voice is going to be dying on me, especially as I'm just talking without Rob here. But as anyone who has decided to look into game development, be it joining a studio, working in Unity, Game Maker, or even just making your own custom engine, you know that it takes a lot of time to make a video game. And because of that, it's very easy to get into that mindset or get into the idea that it's just never going to get finished. You're always going to tweak something. You're going to try and make your dream game. That 5 to 10 year project that you're going to take a second mortgage out on your home to fund. But at the end of the day, it comes down to one thing. The only way for a game to be considered even any attempt at being a success is that it has to be finished. And sometimes you may not get to that point of making a finished game. Or you'll make that game and then you'll realize that maybe this isn't the right game for me and you're going to scrap it and then work on something else. But this is why for a lot of people that we say the idea behind failing small. It's better to make 5 little tiny games that didn't fail but you learned something from, rather than one 5-year project that you just spend your whole life savings on and now nobody wants to play. Because that can be very scary for anybody in game development. That what if you just spend the last 3 to 5 years of your life working on a game day in and day out that nobody wants to play? And this is why you need to be able to understand how to build a game and be able to take that feedback. His next point, and this is one that we've talked about many times over, is of course art. Now, art when it comes to video games is a very subjective topic and one we could spend an hour on in of itself. But from his point in this article is that it's very important to have a unique style. AAA is not a style when it comes to a video game. It is simply just graphical power. And we've said this many times over, but aesthetics in video games can remain viable, or it doesn't lose its luster after years. This is why we always say that 2D or pixel art will never die, because the experts of the genre know how to make something that is visually and aesthetically different and pleasing to the eye. Whereas first generation 3D looks horrible. If anyone has seen like what that looks like, exactly. Style over textures. And it's very easy to fall into that trap of, I'm just going to make my game using Unreal 4, wherever we're up to, and it will sell 500,000 copies. But the thing is, graphics don't make a game. If you type in, military shooter on Google, you're going to pull up probably several hundred images of various games, from Battlefield to Call of Duty to all the other titles that try to imitate them. And it all just begins to drown out in a sea of browns and grays. And this is one of the things that Nintendo does really well. Nintendo doesn't focus these days on the latest graphics. Again, something like Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey probably doesn't look graphically as intensive compared to something like Call of Duty, or even something like Yakuza with the Dragon Engine. But what they do get is a unique style. And you can look at older Mario games like Galaxy or Sunshine, that they still hold up well due to just how clean and visibly distinctive they look. Whereas a lot of the other games that came out that time become very rough. As a very interesting point, I'm just going to look this up really fast. I just want to see what year Super Mario Sunshine was released. That came out in 2002. And let me see. And as a point of comparison, I'm trying to find this. Let's see, when did Grand Theft Auto 3 come out? Grand Theft Auto 3 was 2001. Hey, Red Bolt. So think about that for a second. Grand Theft Auto 3, from its graphical, very pixelated, very blocky characters, is only 1 year behind the art of Super Mario Sunshine. Now, of course, keep in mind that Grand Theft Auto 3 has a lot more in terms of gameplay. But you can see just how much graphics aesthetics will win out over graphical power. As another big example, look at the difference between something like Lawbreakers versus Overwatch. Both are team-based first-person shooters, both have a lot of pedigree behind them. But there's a reason why we still are talking about Overwatch and not Lawbreakers. Because if you type in on Google Images, I'm going to do this really fast, what Lawbreakers looks like, it looks like just about every other first-person shooter or team-based game. It has that same kind of very muted graphics. The characters kind of stand out to some extent, but it's all, very similar, gritty-looking people. Now, we type in Overwatch, and we get this just rainbow color. Well, that's part of it. Rainbow colors of characters. There's a very big difference between someone like Xandra and Tracer, or Soldier 76 and Genji, and everybody's favorite Mai, and Diva, and so on. But the point is, you look at a character from Overwatch, and it stands out. Same goes for Team Fortress. And again, I remember back in 2000, I think it was 6 or 7, when the first images of, maybe we'll get to that question for our second topic. But I remember back in 2006 and 7 when images first leaked from Team Fortress 2, and they were using that art style, and people were complaining about it. They were saying, this isn't a military shooter, this is just, for kids. Nobody's going to pay attention to that. The same goes for Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. My God, I remember all the people complaining about that cel-shaded style. And people saying, I'm going to boycott this game, just as they boycotted Call of Duty as well. But in the end, this style, or when you have that style there, it works. And it becomes almost unkillable in terms of its viability, or it stands the test of time, as the famous saying from Civilization has gone on. And the point is, it's better to do something visually distinctive rather than try and copy it. Because this is another thing that we see from so many first-name developers or first-timers. that they'll just steal a bunch of assets, or they'll copy a bunch of assets off the Unity store, throw that into a video game and think that looks good. But it doesn't really stand out. It just makes your game look cheap in the process. And what Paul talked about is that even when we talk about unique aesthetics, we don't mean, like, it still doesn't mean a 3D game. Games like what he talked about, Caves of Quid, Downwell, or Cultist Simulator, they stand out. They look visually distinctive, and they don't use next-gen graphics, or we could even argue current-gen graphics for their games. As long as the game is unique enough, and you look at this and you immediately recognize it for what it is, that's a success for a lot of people. Now, a point I did make is, if you have someone on staff who is the best damn realistic 3D engine modeler, then focus on that, if that is their strengths. But in that point, you still have to realize where you're aiming at in terms of your game. Like something like What Remains of Edith Finch, or what was the name of that game? Not What Remains of Edith Finch. There's another one that came before that I'm forgetting the name of. Was it What Remains of Edith Finch? I think I'm confusing my visual novel games. What was the game that you were trying to solve a mystery of a the disappearance of Ethan Carter? That's one that I was thinking of. Like, that game went incredibly photorealistic. But again, it did it in such a highly elevated take that it stands out. They didn't just copy or use assets from the Unity store for it. Now, another point that he made, I just want to quickly read this here, is to give yourself the chance of making that game. And again, this goes back to what we already talked about in terms of the allure of independent game development. That if you're going to work in the independent space, don't just try and copy Fortnite or make your next Call of Duty or Hearthstone. Make the game that you're dreaming of making, because that's where your passion's going to lie, and that's what's going to sustain and motivate you over how many months or even years it takes to make your first game. Like we said, it's all that balancing act. You want to balance your passion with understanding the market and being able to realize, what is my unique selling point? What is my core gameplay loop for this title? And at the end of the day, though, that game may not succeed, or you may end up scrapping it. But you still want to make that game and learn from it. Because, again, you have to leverage your passion. You don't want to make a soul-crushing game, but at the same time, you don't want to be blinded to work on the same game for 10 to 15 years of your life. Yep, do not do a calling too, exactly. And let's see. I'm just reading this post, so reading this next part of it as well. Oh, here's one. Stay in the game. And this one that we've talked about at least slightly, but it's one that I think is very important. And it's the idea of avoiding that burnout when it comes to making video games. It's very easy, again, to say, I'm just going to focus for the next 5 years on one game and do nothing else, but then what do I do after that? And it's very important to be able to realize what it means to stay in the industry. Not to, take 2 to 3 mortgages out on your home and hope that your game's going to pay it all off. And he mentioned, of course, Jake Burgett's talk, How to Survive in Games for 11 Years Are Like Hit. And that's a big point. We talked to Jake about this several times, as well as Cliff Harris, that while they have made games that have been successful, probably most people haven't heard of Gratuitous Space Battles or Regency Solitaire. And I'm pretty sure that all the people who are playing and streaming Fortnite probably aren't playing those games as well. But the point is, there's a huge cost in making video games, and it's very important to get that work-life balance right. And as he says, if you want to work in games for your entire career, you really do have to pace yourself. So make sure you do take time off to have, drinks with friends, hang out with loved ones, make sure that you are sleeping, 7 to 8 hours a day. If you want to grind, like we saw with the Stardew Valley developer, or Crunch, I'm sorry, the correct term is Crunch there, then realize you should take time off from that as well. Don't burn out. And make sure that you are actually living your life outside of just making your game. Because if you burn out, then what's left to do after that? And now here's the point that he made that we have talked about extensively. And it's one that we have to keep drilling in. And that is how important the first 5 minutes of your game are to someone who's playing your game for the first time. Because as we've said, so many developers fail at that first time experience. They're going to make a game that is so niche and so focused on, 20 to 30 hours of gameplay, but the first 20 minutes of your game is horrible for someone brand new. And it's very important, as we've said time and again, that you need to make your first experience the best of your game. Because it doesn't matter if your game opens up at hour 10 if people quit at 10 minutes in. And this is again why I don't lose any sleep over not playing a game if it annoys me in the first 10 minutes. Because there really isn't an excuse or a valid excuse anymore for why your game is hard to look at or hard to grasp for a new timer. Especially with Steam Early Access, with being able to have play testing and stuff like that, that if your game isn't interesting in the first 10 minutes, then you failed. And I know that's very blunt, but you have to hear it. And this is why you can't develop your game in a vacuum anymore and expect it to sell. Because we talked with Rob about this, with some of the games that he's published or he's seen, that they're released and they may sell 20 copies and that's it. And then you have a developer thinking, well, it's not my fault the game failed. Maybe the user just didn't understand it. But if that's your excuse for why your game hasn't succeeded, then you just have failed as a game developer. And again, it goes back to when we talk about uniqueness versus refinement. The 100% unique game that has no comparison to anything else is probably going to fail. Because who wants to play a game that they basically have to relearn from scratch when there's literally dozens and hundreds of games being released on a day-to-day basis? And as for bonus points, let's say you release that game in November when Call of Duty and all the big AAA games are being released as well. Now, his next point, I just want to see how many more we have. Yeah, we're almost done with it. But this is another one we've talked about, and that's being able to get attention on your game. Being able to do marketing, or even just simply being sociable online. As we've said, there's that tendency for developers to disappear off the face of the earth for 2 to 5 years, and then appear one day with no marketing, no videos, just no coverage whatsoever, and then they wonder why nobody's buying their game. I mentioned this before when I was looking at this female developer who said she wasn't sure why nobody was playing her game or nobody was buying it, and she worked on it for like 2 to 3 years. But then I go on her YouTube channel, there's like 3 videos that have like 20 views apiece. There's no website for the game, there's no marketing for the game, and there's no discussions about this game anywhere. And again, how do you expect someone to buy your game if nobody's heard of it and nobody's talking about it? And the thing is that it's not just about being able to do marketing, but being able to mention your game, being able to talk to people on Twitter. And there are developers out there who I send emails to for press keys or even just to talk, and they never get back to me. And that is something that you don't do. Because if somebody is reaching out to you who wants to cover your game or discuss things with you, you should take that as a free pass. I remember, I'm not going to name the developer of this, but one developer I emailed them, this was back when the channel only had like 300 subscribers, and I asked him for a press key and to talk to him, and he got back to me, he said this, I'm going to remember this for a long time. he said, I'm going to give you a key, but I don't think you're going to really do much for me, or I don't think there's going to be much value. You're not going to give me much value back, but I'm going to hold out hope that maybe I'm wrong on this. And yeah, that was certainly a slap in the face. And that was the first time that a game developer just said something like that. And it still shocks me that somebody was able to be that brazen, especially considering that his game is still considered very much on the niche side of things. But the point is that as a game developer, you have to put yourself out there. You have to wear your social hat or your business hat as well as being a game designer. I said this before when I talked with Z from Serenity Forge, and he said that there is as much art in the business as there is business in the art. And if you can't get those two sides working for you, you are just not going to succeed. You may release a game, but if nobody plays it, then how well did you actually do? And there is a lot that goes into this. Even people like Jake Burgett, Cliff Harris, and who we talked to earlier with Dave Gilbert, or yeah, I keep confusing Dave and Ron Gilbert there. They understand that you have to be social. You have to be posting on Twitter. If somebody mentions your game or wants to talk to you, you jump at that. Because losing a marketing chance can't be a killer for a video game. And the thing is, if you do things right, it can work out for you. When we talked with Alexis Kennedy with Cultist Simulator, he mentioned that I think the game has sold, beyond their 2-week projection in like 1 week, due to the word of mouth and all the notoriety he gained through Cultist Simulator, with Sunless Sea, the Kickstarter, coming onto this cast to talk to me. And I do need to talk to him more about that. That reminds me, I should send him an email as well when we're done here. But the thing is, and this is a point that Josh, or other Josh, talked to me about as well. It's not about being, business Josh. It's not about me going on Twitter every day and saying, these are the top 10 great games, hashtag game design, hashtag game dev, hashtag indie game dev, and stuff like that. It's about putting yourself out there. Not the marketing or PR you, but just putting you. And if you do that, people, if they do like your stuff, will follow you. I mean, there's a point why we have over 3,000 subscribers here, because they're not just here to look at my, to look at how beautiful or attractive I am and hear my well-meaning voice. They want to watch because they're interested in what I have to say. Now, if I just did, PR speak, or as we've said before, just putting on that persona every time, it's going to get tiring fast. And at the end of the day, though, it could just comes down to being able to put yourself out there. Now, I'm going to have to take a sip every time we have these discussions. I'm going to run out of air and and saliva at this rate. Now, one point that he talked about that I found interesting is confidence. And that is being able to realize that what you do matters. There is that whole discussion about imposter syndrome when it comes to game design, and not realizing or not understanding that you have worth when it comes to game design. And this is one that I don't really have first-hand experience with, but it's important to be confident in yourself and what you do. Not arrogant, as in, I am the best game developer in the world, and how dare you insult my games, and you are nothing compared to me. But being able to realize that you are doing something productive, and that's that kind of energy that's going to keep you motivated, day in and day out. And let me see, we have 3 more points. How long has this part been? Wow, we're only at 40 minutes of the stream. But from there, I lost my place. This is another thing we've talked about. I think this goes back to what we said earlier regarding uniqueness and refinement, and that is polish. And here's his quote, and I think this works well. I firmly believe that the best games are created by a combination of generalized grand-scale systems-oriented thinking and microscopic nitpicking pedantic perfectionism. Whew, Say that 10 times fast. But what his point is that you have to understand both the large scale and the small scale of game development. It's not just you creating this grand masterstroke of 4X grand strategy, the Dwarf Fortress of Dark Souls Battle Royale, Hearthstone. But you also have to be able to polish and understand where you can improve your game. As we said before, it's very easy to fall into that mindset or the echo chamber effect that my game is perfect and there is nothing wrong with it and everything is working great. But you have to be able to realize that death by 1,000 cuts is a very real issue when it comes to game design. And it's very easy for a game to get out of hand when you're not really polishing things or being able to develop things in a way that you're iterating on each design. And it's very hard, and I think what he says is true, it's hard to polish because you're having to work on those annoying problems. And sometimes you may not even think of it as a problem. As we said before, it's very easy for developers to just ignore little quality of life issues, thinking that, the developer will, or the consumer will just get past it. All my fans love this game, they're not complaining about it. But that's not how you grow a game. And when your game has all these annoying pain points in them, and either you're not catching them, or you are ignoring them explicitly, it's going to come back to you. Because we've seen this before, that if 50 to 100 people say that they don't like something and you choose to ignore it, then that will come back to haunt you when your game is at 1.0. Something like Brigador, for instance, and when we talked with Hugh Monahan about this, people were arguing against his tank control scheme. But he felt that that was a major part of his game and he didn't want to change it. But when it was released and all the consumers started complaining about it as well, he realized that he needed to be more accommodating. And that's why Brigador Up Armored has both the tank controls and what we did on stream, with it just being you push in a direction that your vehicle moves in that direction. Now, and we can also talk about something like Skyshine's Bedlam as well, and how he had to make a lot of changes to make that game more friendly, despite the fact that people loved it when he showed it off. But the thing is, 5 people who love your game versus 200 people who think that there's issues, you have to be able to polish it. And again, as we've said, there is that line where you go too far and you're just changing your game, the second somebody says something wrong with it. And there's a fine line between being accommodating and just being completely closed off. But polish is king. And like I said, and what I will continue to say, any game development that doesn't have a period of polish is going to fail. You should be polishing your game throughout development and having people look at that and see where you need to improve on. Now, looking at his posts, we have 2 more topics, and then I need to sip this entire bottle of water that I have next to me to refuel here. But one of his big points is to be honest with yourself. And you have to be able to believe that what you're doing matters. And if it doesn't work, then you have to be able to understand that maybe you need to pivot. You have to change and grow. Just doing the same thing day in and day out and it not working isn't how you're going to improve. This YouTube channel being a big example. For people who have stuck with me since, 10 to 15 subscribers, you've probably seen a huge change on the channel compared to where we're at now. But the point is, you should always be growing. You should always be able to understand where it is that you're trying to achieve and then where to go further. Because nobody who's going to work in this industry has a ceiling of where they want to go. You should always be growing. You should always be continuing to realize that you want to get better. If all you're doing is just making 5-minute, simple platformers for the rest of your life, that's going to get soul-crushing fast. And then, let me see here. just want to read this part really fast. Oh, here it is. So it's kind of, his final point is no more secrets. You should always be willing to talk about games, always be willing to explain things, and always be willing to look or be transparent in your game's design. And he brought up both Mojang Scrolls and, of course, Lawbreakers, as both companies have developed big hits or had that pedigree, and they still failed. And it's important to stick around. It's important to be willing to look at everything when it comes to game design. But definitely read that post, because I'm trying to go through it as quickly as possible. And that is certainly going to be our first topic for today, because I think I'm all out of things to say. But I'm definitely going to try and get him on for a cast, because I would love to talk to him more about his thoughts on things. And we'll see what happens there.